When we think about longevity, we often picture cutting edge biotech, AI, or therapies that might one day slow biological aging. But what if one of the greatest longevity revolutions is already happening today? What if preventing a single infection can add decades of healthy life? And what if the future of longevity isn't just about helping people live to 100, but making sure everyone, regardless of where they are born, has the opportunity to live a long and healthy life? Welcome back to Decoding Longevity. I'm your host, Dr. Raghav Sehgal, joined with my co host, Dr. Maxley Jackus.
Hi, everyone. In our last episode, we have explored how evolution may already had solutions to some of our biggest medical challenges with Ashley Zender, CEO of Faunabio, where we discuss how studying resilient animal species could inspire the next generation of therapies for aging-related diseases. Today, we're looking longevity through entirely different lenses. Our guest is Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, one of the world's leading physician scientists in HIV prevention, tuberculosis research, and global public health. She's the director of Desmond Tutu HIV Center, CEO of the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, former president of the International AIDS Society, and has spent decades transforming HIV from fatal disease into one that can increasingly be prevented altogether. Professor Beaker, welcome to Decoding Longevity.
Thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So, many people think of longevity as extending lifespan through new technologies, but your career reminds us that one of the greatest gains in human longevity has come from preventing infectious diseases. How do you personally define longevity?
Yeah, I think it is more than just longevity. It is also about the health span. So we go beyond the lifespan to the health span. And can we keep people not only living longer, but can they live longer healthily?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest, particularly where I live here in Africa, one of the biggest ways that people's longevity is eroded is through infectious diseases. So, one of the biggest ways that we can extend people's longevity is to prevent infectious diseases. And infectious diseases have been changed through vaccination, through antibiotics, through clean water, for that matter. And so there's no doubt that the breakthroughs we've had in the last couple of centuries, from vaccines to antibiotics, just to pure sanitation, have extended people's lifespans, but more importantly, have extended people's health spans too.
I love the perspective because longevity isn't about adding years, as Ragav has mentioned. It's about ensuring that people that have the opportunity to reach out in an old age in good health. And you have lived through the HIV epidemic from the earliest days. So you have seen a disease that was once considered a death sentence, really, be transformed through extraordinary scientific progress. So looking back, what lessons do you think HIV can teach us about the power of biomedical research? And also gives us hope into longevity itself or health span overall. So very interesting to see your point of view
Yeah,
in
thanks,
this.
Maxie. I mean, it was a devastating time, right? And it really was at the turn of the new millennium, around 2000, where we hit the nadir of HIV mortality and morbidity. And it's important for people to realize that this was young people, children under the age of 5, and then people in the prime of their lives. So breadwinners, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, the people who employ other people. These were the people who were dying of AIDS, and I mean, dying in droves, so that we were attending funerals almost all the time. And then tragically, these young babies. So if a baby was conceived in a woman living with HIV, there was a 1 in 3 chance that that child would have HIV, and then a 1 in 2 chance that that child would die of AIDS before the age of 2. So really very tragic. And as a result, we saw longevity literally fall off 10, 15 years. All the gains that had been made in the 20th century in terms of coming with antibiotics and vaccines and rolling back the death toll, young death toll in countries such as we find in Africa or in other LMICs, suddenly HIV now having a really devastating impact of causing death. And on the other hand, when antiretrovirals came about, so these are, if you like, antibiotics for viral pathogens, we saw this roll back again. So we have this huge dip in longevity, and then we actually see longevity being restored by access to antivirals. And this meant getting it to everybody who needed it in a time that they could see restoration of their immunity, reduction in morbidity, reduction in opportunistic infections, and again, a restoration of well-being. And that's been the miracle of anti-HIV treatment. It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. It is quite incredible, and it's so inspiring to hear, from your perspective, going through everything. It is incredible to think that one generation has witnessed HIV go from almost universally fatal, as we have described, and even young people, to a chronic manageable condition, and now potentially even preventable, which is quite incredible. So one of the biggest stories in medicine over the past years has been the Purpose One trial, where twice yearly, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Lenacapavir demonstrated an extraordinary protection to HIV acquisition in young women. And you presented these landmark findings and have described this moment as very, very deeply emotional. Can you take us back to that day when I was actually, proven and discovered?
Yeah, so quite right. It's called Lenacapavir. It's a capsid inhibitor. So it inhibits the capsid, which contains the genetic material of the RNA virus that is known as the human immunodeficiency virus. And that causes AIDS, right? And by acting on the replication of the virus, it stops the virus being produced. And if you have the drug on board ahead of exposure, what Purpose 1 and Purpose 2 showed, these were the two registrational trials, they showed that they could actually stop acquisition of HIV in somebody who might be exposed to the virus. And these trials, these were registrational trials to prove the efficacy of lenacapavir as a pre-exposure prophylactic agent. And of course, when we don't yet have a vaccine, which we don't have for HIV, this is a very good interim measure. It does mean that you have to have the drug on board before exposure. And of course, you need to come back. So in the case of lenacapavir, which is so exciting, is you only have to come back every 26 to 28 weeks. So it's a 6-monthly injectable agent. And that gives people incredible freedom because it isn't a daily pill and it almost is as good as a vaccine. Although, of course, with a vaccine, we expect, durable protection. It does mean people do have to come back on time, but at least you only have to think about it twice a year. So the context here is that in my part of the world, adolescent girls and young women are mostly at risk for HIV acquisition. And this is for multiple structural and societal reasons. I can tell you that half the infections that are occurring in the world today, and there was 1.2 million of them last year, that half of those infections happen in adolescent girls and young women in low and middle income countries in Africa. The other half happen in what we call key populations, so people who are very vulnerable to HIV but often are underserved, LGBTQI people, sex workers, drug-using communities. Those make up the other half of the 1.2 million infections around the world. We really need answers for these people. And lenacapavir, we discovered was such a biomedical intervention. And I had the pleasure of leading the trial here in South Africa and then, giving the results in Munich in 2024. And it was a deeply moving experience just from the sheer sort of incredulousness that we could have something that could completely prevent HIV. So we had 100% efficacy on that trial, which we had never seen before, particularly in young women and girls. And there were just 2 infections in the Purpose 2 trial, overall giving us an efficacy well above 98%. And extraordinary prospects for rolling this biomedical intervention out and really making a dent in the incidence curves in the world today.
Um, Now, one thing that really struck to me wasn't just the efficacy here, it was also sort of the means for autonomy. And instead of someone just having to have a pill every day, we're talking about protection with just 2 injections a year. That could completely sort of change ultimately your longevity. They often think about extending life after disease develops, but your work demonstrates that prevention may be our most powerful longevity intervention. How has prevention, sort of, in your perspective, changed the trajectory of HIV, and what lessons can longevity medicine learn from that?
I think we have to be aware that whilst we have made HIV a chronic illness, and people are living again, healthy, strong lives with antiretroviral agents, they are still living with the virus. And this is why we refer to people as people living with HIV. And the fact of the matter is, you constantly have that concern that should you stop your antiviral treatment, the virus will bounce back. It'll come back in full strength. And again, wreak havoc in terms of immune systems. In addition, we have better understanding now that the virus is quietly at work in the background as an it has some inflammatory effects even as people are suppressed on their viruses. And so we do want people to take their treatment. We do want them to be virally suppressed. But always, the old adage, prevention is better than cure, is 100% true today. And so where we can prevent HIV, it really is valuable to do so. And so having strong tools to be able to do this in a way that doesn't cramp people's lifestyle, doesn't undermine their well-being, is really important. And so this notion of dosing a preventive intervention less frequently, with more discretion, giving people more autonomy, as you say, I think not only ensures prevention, but it also ensures prevention with well-being, with the sense of I'm healthy, I can forget about this now that I've got it on board. I only have to think about it again in 6 months' time. So I think it truly is a breakthrough for the globe and for the epidemic. And I'm confident that if we can roll it out sufficiently, that then we will see an impact on new infections around the world. And we have 1.2 million to win back. So there's work to be done.
It's quite incredible. And I think, I know, coming from a disease stage or a condition, this philosophy actually mirrors where longevity medicine is heading at the moment. So preventing disease before it develops, rather than waiting until it's irreversible, or just managing decline as we have been for many, 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 many years. And we have seen time and time again that it simply doesn't work. So you have also spent, yeah, so it's incredible. But before I shift here, to talk a little bit about your work in tuberculosis, which remains one of the world's leading infectious killers as well, particularly among people living with HIV. So how does HIV, tuberculosis, you talk about chronic inflammation and aging, intersect biologically? Because we know that there's a lot of the inflammatory processes, but very curious to hear what else have you found that managed or like that there is an intersection across all of those conditions.
Yeah, so they absolutely feed off each other. There is no doubt. And we often think about the sort of dual twins, the dual disasters of HIV and TB. And so maybe listeners aren't aware that as HIV takes hold, it reduces the ability of the of the individual who's living with the virus to respond with a strong immune system. In particular, T cells are affected. And with that reduction in immunity, particularly around cell mediated immunity, tuberculosis, which might have been on board already as a latent infection or comes at the person as a novel new infection, the ability of the individual to fight it off is much reduced. And so we see a huge increase in people going down with tuberculosis if they are living with HIV, and particularly if they're untreated. And so one of the biggest killers of people living with HIV is actually untreated tuberculosis. And it's a slightly different disease as well. It often isn't just in the lungs, it often spreads throughout the body, and it's a hugely inflammatory disease in that form. So, people lose weight, have very high fevers, their markers of inflammation go through the roof, and often, this is what brings them into hospital, and it often is a terminal condition if we don't catch it early enough. Now, of course, tuberculosis is treatable. And so as long as we make a diagnosis and get people onto anti-TB therapy, we can certainly restore well-being. If people then go on to their anti-HIV treatment and their immunity is restored, then they can also fight off the TB and keep it at bay. But what we have found here is that people have had 3, 4, 5 bouts of TB while they've been living with their HIV, and all of that erodes well-being, right? It leaves sequelae in the lungs, it leaves its impact, and add on to this now that our community or cohort of people living with HIV are aging into older age, you have another inflammatory condition, coming along. And of course, that's a natural inflammatory process. We all have to age ultimately. But it really isn't, it's not a good scene if you are, not dealing with your tuberculosis, you're living with HIV and you're aging. All of this leads to reductions in longevity and certainly undermines well-being. So it's really important that people, regardless of age, get themselves tested, make sure that they know what their HIV status is. And if, they are living with HIV, that they are aware of tuberculosis. Again, we have ways to prevent TB. So it's a prophylactic, and we use, again, an anti-TB agent as a prophylactic to stop people going down with tuberculosis. So we do now have these biomedical tools, and they're improving what we can do for people living with HIV or people who may be in a place where TB is endemic. And too often, both of those are in the same place at the same time.
It's quite interesting. And of course, the common thread across all of this is inflammation, which kind of links all of these infectious diseases and biological aging together. Now, one thing that kind of really stood out to me of your research and your work is your commitment to sort of community-led research. You've specifically sort of worked with women and adolescent girls, as well as all the effect you have had across the board with different communities. It's quite amazing. As sort of longevity research sort of spreads across the globe, how important do you see health equity being a critical component of this as the future of longevity?
Yeah, it's quite a reflection that this has been a recurring pattern over these 4 decades. I think the extraordinary thing about the HIV field is that we took it head on, and we took it head on with civil society. So, extraordinary work from civil society in America, in Europe, through ACT UP, through other groups who tag, and many other groups who said, this injustice stops here and we have to bring equity. In my part of the world, groups such as the Treatment Action Campaign, Zaki Ahmad stood up and said, I'm not going to take antivirals until everybody can have antivirals. And he put his own life at risk in order to do so. And I have been part of that campaign right from the beginning to say, we have these extraordinary biomedical tools, but we can't have them in the places where the diseases are not. And too often, the treatments are places where the diseases are not, and the diseases are where the treatments are not. And we have to turn that around, and because it is a disease in its own right, injustice and inequality, and it sharpens the incredible differences in the world, and the fact that some people get to have lifespans and some people don't, I think is, and some of that just is dependent on geography and politics and money. So I think we have to continue that campaign. Too often we are not completely without, but we are delayed. So I can tell you that in my part of the world, there is very little discussion going on about the fact that people living with HIV are now aging. In the Northern Hemisphere, 50% of people living with HIV are well getting over the age of 50. Here it's more like 15 to 20%, but that population is getting older, and we really do need to start thinking about the fact that HIV does turn the biological clocks back earlier. And we do see premature aging in people living with HIV. And this is the time to prevent that happening in an accelerated fashion. So what can we be doing today for people living with HIV to make sure that they really do reach the lifespans that they can because of our biomedical interventions, but even the health spans, so they live quality filled lives for all the time that they have. And so that's the new campaign, is to say, are we aware, number one? Number two, what are we doing to teach the community about this? And three, what are we actually doing to prevent this happening in an accelerated way? And we're busy trying to get that out to communities as much as
Yeah, that really highlights how scientific innovation can become a social movement and social innovation as well, which is amazing and not spoken enough, in my opinion. So, looking ahead, maybe in a few years or 10 years, where do you think the whole field of HIV is going? And are we moving towards more functional cures, not just prevention, but maybe vaccines, the elimination of the disease? And what are some of the discoveries that you personally believe it could be translated to the longevity research, given that HIV could and have, as we've spoken before, represents an accelerated aging model. So if we can deaccelerate aging in these people, could we potentially find some things that can be translated to longevity?
an extraordinary question, and just loaded with so many things. My head is, you know, all over the place as to ideas about all of this. The first thing I want to say is that I do think we're moving, and it hits on a little bit of what Ragev was just saying. I think, moving into an era where we really want to increase self-care, that people start to take charge of their own well-being and their own outcomes, their own destiny when it comes to their health. And there's work to be done, particularly in low and middle income countries, where people have many priorities, many of which, far exceed their health and well-being. But I think we have to really bring that home, that people can take their own health into their hands, and they have really an accountability to do so. So that, I think, is something I'm hoping we're going to see more of. So it is this notion of, I am going to prevent by stepping up for pre-exposure prophylaxis. I'm going to prevent by doing a self-test frequently to see where I am. I'm going to, be ahead of the curve in this regard. Then I do think, this breakthrough with injectable new formulations that are less frequently dosed, and have delayed release or come in different forms. I mean, I'm even hearing about an implant of an antiviral that could last up to 4 years. Can you imagine? I mean, that really starts to transform what we're talking about. It's almost science fiction in a way. If we can get to those places, we can really say to people, your self-care is your responsibility, but we're going to provide you with these extraordinary array of tools that really make that self-care very feasible and manageable. So that's another area where I think we're going. It's not only in HIV medicine, we're seeing it in psychiatry, we're seeing it in endocrine, we're seeing it in rheumatological, advances, etc. So less frequently dosed, better formulations that last for longer to give people, less every day focusing on their health needs, and move us into a prevention type approach. And then what you've alluded to, which I think is the cornerstone of bringing an epidemic under control, is either a vaccine and or a cure. Now, with a vaccine, I believe we can get epidemic control. I think we can even begin to talk about eliminating transmission of the virus. Without a cure, we can't talk about getting rid of AIDS, right? And so if we want to finally see the end of AIDS, we're going to need a cure. To see control and elimination of transmission, we need a vaccine. And that is underway. And we need more understanding that R&D has to continue, because I've been hearing very concerning rumblings about how money and grants for that kind of research are decreasing and becoming restrictive. And that is dismaying, because I think we're getting to a place in the world where technology is improving at such a quick pace that I believe we can actually, devise the tools that will enable us to get a vaccine. And where vaccine research is going in HIV is this notion of broadly neutralizing antibodies. And what's very exciting about finding a way to get either the immune system to make broadly neutralizing antibodies, or indeed to passively transfer broadly neutralizing antibodies in the form of monoclonal antibodies for passive immunization, that these can also be used in the field of cure and remission. And, the technology can be used in other areas such as cancer research, and so on and so forth, or other chronic diseases, chronic genetic diseases, as we're hearing. So I think these fields are beginning to collide. It's the technology that is, bringing a lot of win-wins, if you like, and I think is making it very feasible that we could have an HIV vaccine within the next couple of decades. I wouldn't say the next decade, because I think the experimental medicine is underway, and I think there's some exciting research coming through, but then we would need some sort of efficacy trial just to prove that actually the product worked. Any vaccine we find is definitely going to benefit cure. We know that we can get to remission. There's excellent research happening around the world to show that if you get in early enough into an acute infection, you get the reservoir of HIV right down in terms of where the virus sits in the body once it's taken hold. If we get those reservoirs down, that we really have a very good option to bring people into HIV remission, which means they may be able to stop antiretrovirals at least for some time. So I think all of this is helping us, move closer to a vaccine and ultimately to a cure. And that's when we can truly talk about generations free of the infection known as HIV.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and a beautiful vision set by you, Linda, I have to say. And I have to again say, you've really spent your career sort of translating extraordinary science into real world public health, which is quite amazing and inspiring. Uh,
Thank
we do have one final question for you, which we ask all our guests, which is, you've been an amazing guest who has really inspired us. Who would you suggest as our next guest to the podcast? Alan suggested you, and thanks to that, we have had sort of amazing insights from you. Who would you think should be our next guest who can talk about sort of aging science and longevity quite strongly? And
Well,
sounds phenomenal.
Maxio, I'm not sure whether you've engaged with Sharon Lewin at all. So she's in Melbourne, and I'm afraid I'm going to stay on the HIV theme, but she's also doing beautiful work in cure specifically, and she now runs the Doherty Institute in Melbourne. and just does beautiful, beautiful work. Also now talking about gene therapy and gene technology. She is the person who recently described a very nice manuscript in a lovely study and in a manuscript on how they were actually able to cut the HIV gene out. And so I think there's all sorts of applications from that work. She also has an extraordinary talent for turning quite tricky scientific concepts into very understandable ideas. So I would recommend Sharon Lewin. She is the immediate past president of the IAS. So there's also a theme here that she was a former president of the International AIDS Society as well, and a strong woman from Australia. So I would recommend Sharon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It really reminds us that longevity isn't just about breakthrough technologies, but it's also about prevention, equity, and ensuring the scientific advances can reach the overall community, not just a privileged few. So thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I was really honored.
And to our listeners, we'll link Professor Becker's work at the Desmond Tutu HIV Center and the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and the landmark purpose studies in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, let's keep longevity.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.